Okay, so I will introduce our guest, Robert Altinger. He's a highly experienced technology leader who has led large distributed teams, 400 plus, at global corporates, and spent the last 15 years spinning up startups in US, Europe, and Asia Pacific. He's currently the Senior Vice President of Engineering and Operation at ESW Capital. So Robert, thank you very much for being here. So we are going to take questions from this big screen and also from the audience. Okay. So I guess we could start with the first questions, which is already there on the screen.
Okay. The question is from Adrian Petricha. You said relating to AI that we have to take responsibility and that engineers need to be at the forefront. Now, responsibility, especially in the case of programming in AI, is primarily an ethical term. What about ethics in AI? Who's to discern possibility from desirability? That is an excellent question. There are a lot of very senior technologists out there who are quite worried about precisely this question. How do you make the AI actually do what you want it to do? Microsoft released an AI recently that some guys thought it was kind of funny to train to become a racist Nazi. So they basically kept hammering it away with questions and so forth and so on, and the AI learned from its responses and turned it into something that Microsoft had to shut off after a day. So AIs are quite vulnerable to manipulation, and it's very important to understand how we're going to actually do that. AI is at its infancy, and we don't really know how we're going to do this. It is, however, an interesting point. Who is responsible for ethics? Is it the politicians? Does anybody trust them to actually be responsible for ethics in AI? It's going to have to be some kind of engineers, and in my view, it'll probably take the form something similar to how Wikipedia does it. Wikipedia has a system of tiered reviews, and people can change things. It's reviewed by editors. If you don't agree, you take it to a moderator. If the moderators don't agree, Jimmy Wales decides. And it's going to have to be something like that. I would welcome the usual way we solve things in open source, which is that somebody writes an RFP with a proposed solution, and then it can get debated by the open community to come up with a way to actually do this. There is no right answer to this question today, but it is exactly the kind of questions that engineers should be worried about, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. The first question from the public. Maybe you can hand over the mic.
Yeah, I think I'm fine without one.
Okay, thank you.
Just to develop on the question, it was my question.
Are you Adrian?
I don't think it's politicians, but I disagree with being only engineers. Like, because even with the financial crisis, CDO, CDS, everything was engineered. There were mathematical models. It was like, yeah, risk is, we can manage. And no one thought of moral hazard. So what about including, I don't know, not politicians.
Not bankers, surely.
I don't know. What about philosophy? Because
I agree.
engineers are not trained.
You are not wrong. You are not wrong.
For moral reasons.
Philosophers would definitely be a good choice. The issue is the practical implications of implementing a solution of that kind, okay? Just because philosophers are good at ethics, which I totally acknowledge that they are, doesn't mean that they're going to be in a position to be implemented in this way. I agree. They should be brought into the conversation. But it's going to be engineers, primarily, because we have moved into a position where we are actually in more of a controlling area. And we are the ones programming these things, right? So engineers will have to decide to bring the philosophers in, right? And I totally agree it's a really good idea and should be considered. Engineers don't have all of the answers, but engineers need to take their responsibility seriously. A friend of mine once said, doctors have a license to kill people one at a time, but engineers, when they build bridges and skyscrapers, have responsibility over thousands of people. And they have to take their ethics and their responsibilities very seriously. So there is an underlying, in serious professional engineering, there is an underlying responsibility that they are already aware and it is taught in the good engineering schools. So I totally agree. It's not sufficient to let engineers do it because they'll get distracted, they're off onto the next innovation. And this is a watchdog function, which is very important that it be done correctly and in a way that benefits society. So I take your point. Thank you for making it.
Another question from the public?
Hi. Somewhat on the question Adrian asked earlier, but a little more on the subject of your presentation. So I totally agree with the fact that engineers have a very big role, and they will have a bigger role as we progress. However, the situation and the evidence now is that engineers aren't really at the top level of the decision making. So clearly there's something missing. My question is, what is missing in the engineering or in the engineer's preparation or understanding, or what's missing what engineers don't have that's needed to go further, to actually get to the point where we can make the big impact in the proper way, obviously.
Okay, that's also a very good question. So, how to address that? Okay, what's wrong with engineers? Okay, okay. First of all, let me give you an example from my own experience at Microsoft. Okay, back in the day, okay, there was a company called Netscape, and I actually attended the first training course that Netscape did as a company ever. And I had dinner with Mark Andreessen and some of the founders, and we were discussing, browsers and the implications of the internet early, right? And it was a very interesting conversation. But what Microsoft did is it sat in Seattle, and it had nobody in Washington. It didn't have a single lobbyist, okay? And Bill Gates was of the naive impression that if you listen to your customers and try to put features in your product that they wanted, that the market would just take care of things, right? Whereas Netscape had a guy who essentially used to run AT&T on their board, okay? And as a telco monopoly, he knew that you have to have like an army of people paying politicians and basically get plugged into the levers of power in a different way, because if you can convince enough senators that your competitor is a monopolist, okay, then you can do all sorts of damage to their business. And Microsoft didn't learn that lesson immediately. They did afterwards, and then they started spending serious money in that respect. So engineers have a tendency to focus on engineering problems and ignore the outside world. I'll give you another humorous story as well. There was a policeman who thought it was a good idea to stalk Bill Gates outside his house every morning because Bill had a little bit of a lead foot and he would speed when he was on his way to work, and the guy would just follow him, ring sirens, here's your ticket, right? So Bill ignored him, okay, and he paid the ticket, he paid another ticket, and then on the third time he had the mosquito problem, right? You're sitting there coding away at your keyboard and a mosquito comes along and buzzes and you're busy, so you just basically shoo him away, right? Until it lands right on your nose and stings you. Then you put your hands off the keyboard and you go and address the problem. So what Bill did was he went to pay a law firm over $1 million to follow that policeman around and ruin him, right? Find out if he's doing anything wrong ever, challenge every single ticket that he gives anybody in any place at any time, basically see if he jaywalks, just 24/7 harassment, okay? Because I'm rich and I don't like people stalking me, right? So in the same way, engineers have this focus on what they think is the problem. And they sometimes don't look around them and notice that they have to bring that 90% in with them. Okay? You're charging ahead, you're innovating, you're having fun, you're drinking beer. It's great. And then it's like, I'm not there with the rest of the team. They haven't come with me into the solution set, right? So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that transitions and transformations, especially the kind we're talking about, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, information revolution, those things take time, okay? The hunter-gatherers didn't go away just because the first kingdoms came up. It took centuries before they were all out and we were all kingdoms. And kingdoms are still with us today. Just look at Saudi Arabia, right? So the fact that in 1648 we started to do nation states doesn't mean it happens overnight. The information revolution with the transnational stuff and the engineers starting to take power in various areas, that's also not going to happen overnight. And believe me, the politicians will not go down without a fight, right? So you're going to see evolutionary change, and it's going to take decades before we actually see the full results of that. And as engineers, we probably won't live to see the final transformation in this space. But we should be cognizant of our responsibilities, and we should try to get everything going in the right direction. Because if we don't, who will? I hope that answers your question.
Hey, Robert. So I have two questions. What's your take on...
You're only allowed one.
Sorry?
Start with one.
Okay. But I have two good ones. So.
Ask one first, and then
okay,
I'll ask
sir.
the other
so,
one.
What's your take on full stack engineers?
What's my take on?
Full stack. Like, I know in many cases, companies prefer everybody to just niche, focus on just like one technology or one tool. On the other hand, there are many companies that really encourage full stack guys. So what's the difference? What's your take on the balance between being full stack or full stack aware or full stack knowledgeable or full stack hands-on versus very niched, using one tool, two tools only, one technology or two technology stops? That would be my first question.
Okay. Depends on our definition of the word engineer. Okay. There are many different words that we use and so forth. My view of an engineer is effectively an innovator. Okay. There are many kinds of engineering, as I pointed out in my speech, right? You can do process engineering. You go there, you look at the way somebody's doing something, and you instinctively know that it sucks, right? And if you come up with something that simplifies it, applies engineering elegance, does the things that I basically suggested that you do before you drink beer, okay, then I would qualify you as an engineer, okay? People who code, okay, and they do, you know, tons and tons of C code, are not necessarily engineers, okay? At least the way I would define an engineer, right? When I was at university, I went to a particularly good engineering school, and they said, okay, here's the exam, okay? The exam is like the real world. If you want, you can ask your friend what the answer is and write it down if you're sure that it's the right answer, okay? You can look it up on Google. You can basically bring your own pet mathematician or your own pet coder to actually do the math for you. But your job is to solve the problem, okay? We're going to give you a problem, like a real world problem. This building is going to fall down. You have to figure out what to do, right? How do you solve the problem, okay? That is the essence of engineering, okay? And to do that, you need to understand the problem holistically, okay, as an engineer, right? So, you know, I know lots of schools teach people to code, and what I typically find is that the educational system tries to teach people to code obsolete stuff, right? You know, they're still teaching people Pascal. You know, I don't know anybody that uses it, right? But, you know, the educational systems lag the real world in terms of, you know, actually teaching you how to do stuff, right? What you're supposed to learn is you're supposed to learn how to fix stuff and how to analyze problems, okay? If you can do that, you can learn the other stuff, right? So my view is a real engineer is somebody that actually looks at a problem holistically and comes up with a creative solution that solves that problem, okay? I view myself as an engineer. I don't code, right? but I fix problems. So, you know, I don't know if our definitions are the same, but my view is you probably need both, but the engineers I was talking about in my speech are the 2% that are actually coming up with the innovation, which is not necessarily the guys that are doing the detailed work. Generally speaking, the guys doing the detailed work don't have the flexibility to actually do holistic solutions because they're told, you know, I need you to code this module in this much time, go code it, right? So, you know, we need those guys too, but we should always bear an engineering mindset in our view so that we actually progress to the point where we can actually do real solutions. So hopefully that answers your first question. What's your second one?
Yeah, pretty much. Am I allowed for the second one?
No. We don't have time, right?
We're out of time?
Let's take the second question. I don't know. Can we have? Okay.
Last question.
Last question.
Anybody else have one? No? Okay, Dylan.
So, since you're leading quite a big structure, how did you see the difference in approach towards innovation in different cultures around the world?
How did I see, well, to be honest with you, an interesting part of the fun part of my job is to understand culture, okay? Culture is, in my view, really important if you're building serious teams. And there are massive differences between the way people view things. I'll give you a quick example. I was in Japan setting up a data center, and the Japanese feel physical pain when they are not allowed to reboot servers in a data center if there's a problem, right? They were calling me in Redmond saying, we are not allowed to reboot your servers which are down until we receive the ticket from the guys in Redmond who are not noticing for 20 minutes that your servers are down. So we are standing there all around the server that's having a problem, waiting for the actual instruction, and it actually gives us pain, right? We are physically embarrassed that we are failing you because we are leaving your server down longer than it should be, right? And I solved that problem by writing to senior management in Redmond and saying, I'm going to make the Japanese responsible for the servers worldwide because they have the right attitude. Okay? So, you know, you're sitting there, and a quick one, I got a call from the Americans when I was in Germany, and they said, you know, there's a bug, and the workaround is not to use the, you know, don't hit the Shift Z X combination keystrokes on the keyboard because that actually causes the application to fall over. And I issued an announcement and I said, guys, you cannot hit Shift Z X on your keyboards because it will crash the system. And we were still experiencing the bug, right? So I wrote back to the Americans, the bug is still there. They said, no, your guys are definitely hitting that key combination. I said, those guys are Germans. There's freaking dust growing on those keys, right? If you told them not to do it, they will never do it, okay? So, you know, learn, because you're not looking at what the problem is. You're just assuming something which you don't know, and it's a cultural thing. So that hopefully is the answer to that question, and we're out of time. Is that correct? Thank you for your time,
Robert.
guys.